Last Thursday, activists in Rhode Island blocked the entrance to a facility where U.S. defense contractor Raytheon makes weapons. The activists were protesting the company's arms sales to Israel and Saudi Arabia, as well as its role in, quote, militarizing the U.S.-Mexico border. Raytheon is also, Alyssa, I'm sure, going to come in for a lot of criticism in the next couple of weeks for it being part of a military-industrial complex that fueled our continued occupation in and with Afghanistan, and leading to this, rapid collapse. People saying, we spent $1 trillion+ and this is what we get for it. Do you feel like they will kind of escape criticism here, or do you think that the role of Raytheon, the role of the Pentagon secretary are going to be highlighted?
So I think the private defense contractors will definitely get pulled into the broader discussion, how after 20 years in Afghanistan, our mission there has more or less appears to have failed. But I would say this, the onus is on the policymakers. It is a private corporation like Raytheon's job to create next generation weaponry. They are, on the cutting edge of hypersonics, on things that we're going to need in potential future battles with whether it's a China or a Russia. But I think it's going to be valid to have their perspectives, especially if there's hearings on Capitol Hill about we armed so many people, we had the technology present in Afghanistan. Why were the Afghan security forces not able to hold the ground on their own? But I ultimately think this comes back to bad policy. Like you noted that this protest was about the U.S.-Mexico border being militarized. That's members of Congress. Right. That's the Biden administration.
And so I noted on Twitter yesterday that most of, and I was only being half serious, but I said that, yes, $1 trillion+ was spent in Afghanistan, but most of it never left Northern Virginia. So I'm curious if you fact checked that, down to the dollar, how accurate do you think it would be? How much of the money that we spend on these overseas military projects doesn't actually end up leaving? And we can include suburban Maryland in this too.
Well, I'm sure there is something to that. I mean, it's a fascinating point. To folks who don't know the region, all of the big defense contractors are based in Roslyn, Crystal City, Pentagon City, and I can guarantee
right around the Pentagon.
Yeah, I can guarantee you billions of dollars never left that region. I mean, just one quick point that I made: it wasn't just protesting the militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border, but also weapon sales to the Saudis and to the Israelis. Look, as long as warfare is something that exists, which is just endemic to humanity, there is going to be a business around warfare. And there is a benefit, much like the discussion we had around pharmaceutical companies, there is a benefit to companies creating the best technologies and the most advanced weapons so that when we do fight wars, we can fight them and win. The question then becomes, when do ethics play into it? When is profiting off of war something that we need to address? And I think these are questions that Congress is going to be asking about in the coming weeks as Afghanistan falls.
All right. And when it comes to the images that we're seeing coming out of Kabul right now, I'm wondering, how much do you think the fear of those images drove U.S. policy over the last, say, 10 and 15 years? That, if on the one hand, you can just keep everything going for one extra day. You can keep things going long enough that, hey, when I retire from the military, I can go over to Raytheon, do work for them, or whatever element of the military-industrial complex. Keep it going when the alternative is a rapid collapse and a kind of a humiliation. And so you just say, you know what? One more week. Let's just keep stitching it together. And I think Biden is going to face a lot of criticism for how this has unfolded. And I'm curious, how do you leave and not have something like this happening? Like, is other than a complete surrender in which you turn over the keys in a ceremony to the Taliban and then have an orderly departure. But if you're engaged in the fiction that the previous Afghan government is going to be able to stand up to the Taliban, when they don't stand up, how do you have a situation that is anything but what we're seeing now?
Well, Kim Iversen, our colleague, had a great tweet over the weekend basically saying we had to send in 5,000 more troops to be able to pull our troops out. And it's like comedically and tragically true that that's how this works. Being completely honest, having served in the policymaking role at the DOD and White House around this for the Trump administration, my guess is there was no one's goal was ever to draw down to zero. So there were many versions of this where we're going to go from 5,000 forces in Afghanistan to 2,500. And there's something about if you're able to get into that sweet spot of 1,000 to 1,500 troops, you could say we're not technically in that country. And I say that in the sense that we have troops in over 130 countries around the world. We don't talk about the fact that we have
occupying Germany.
Correct, exactly. So that was, I think, what the Pentagon's long-term strategy was, is to get it to a sustainable place where a small residual force of that level is what we could have. I think what the Biden administration did just remarkably wrong is we could have drawn down to that number, and while we're doing it, evacuate our diplomatic staff, evacuate Afghan interpreters, take 6 months to do that. Do it the right way, but going down to zero, all the while leaving tens of billions of dollars of military equipment for the Taliban to use against us in a future war. It's just an utter failure.
It calls to mind that famous Rumsfeld quote where he said, "You don't go to war with the army you may want. You go to war with the army that you have." In the same way, you leave. You retreat with the army that you have, and you also retreat with the country that you have. And so I wonder if, while that does sound like a reasonable plan, we're not a country that's kind of set up to do that, because you could give us 6 months and we will not have processed more than 2 or 3 interpreters, and we won't have done the things that we needed to do to get to that place. 6 months will have passed, and you will still have all of these different forces that are just kind of making sure that the status quo is glued onto the ground. And so the only option then becomes, no, we're actually just leaving. Maybe I'm wrong, but you've seen the government up close. Are we actually capable of executing a plan like the one that you laid out?
I think that the tragedy of this moment, there are many things in it, but the pure bureaucracy at every level that was not dealt with prior, the inability to process visas, State Department systems going down when people are trying to flee Afghanistan and are applying on their phones for them. So yes, our bureaucracy is not well suited to handle this, but I would make this note. President Biden came into office and said, diplomacy is back. America's going to lead. Well, diplomacy is not Joe Biden, posing with Angela Merkel and the G7 and our NATO allies. That's easy. Any president could do that. What diplomacy would have been is spending the last 6 months in office talking to regional partners of the Afghanis, talking to our NATO allies and saying, how many Afghan interpreters could we relocate here? Trying to actually have a place to house these people, and then we could manage the airlift and the evacuation of it. No legwork seems to have been done, and it's just a remarkable failure at every level.
Right, and Canada's humiliating us by saying they're going to take 20,000 people in. And as I was mentioning, Raytheon trended on Twitter over the weekend for their financial gains in Afghanistan. Critics were quick to slam the company's arms sale after photos of U.S. weapons were captured with Taliban fighters. So things seem to have gone quite well for Raytheon over these years.
I will say this, though, that imagery will follow Raytheon. That's not something that they want to see, is their weaponry in the arms of Taliban fighters who I think, we could probably virtually predict we will at some point in the future, the U.S. military, be fighting again, if not our allies abroad. So I think it's a terrible situation that we're in.
What does Chekhov say? If Raytheon produces a gun in the first chapter, it's going to get fired by the end of it. Tomorrow on Rising, Professor Richard Wolff joins us for an economics update. Team Rising will also be here.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a video. We'll see you tomorrow.
See you then.